Welcome everyone to this week's IPLD Sync and Community Meeting. It's August the 1st, 2022. And as every 2 weeks, we talk about IPLD stuff and things we've worked on. And of course, if anyone has questions or proposals or anything to discuss about IPLD. I wasn't here for a few weeks, so I don't have any updates. I don't know if there was a meeting 2 weeks ago or not. So perhaps the meeting notes are carried over again. Rod?
Yeah, so there was a meeting, and it was just me meeting with myself.
Okay.
It was a fascinating meeting, absolutely fascinating. So the notes, where's my tab? The notes in the current doc are the leftovers from that meeting that I wrote up for myself that I'm going to repeat today. So, and I'm just going to add another thing to this because I've just made something else happen. Hello. My notes are, and this is reaching a little bit back now. So GoCar had a security release a number of weeks back. Just wanted to put that on people's radars if they haven't seen that, because they probably should upgrade. There's an advisory in the doc, or you can just go to the GoCar repo and you'll find a link to it. It was to do with allocation related problems. Jaropo did some fuzzing and found some ways that byte arrays could be allocated that are way too large by a malformed car. So there's a few places. There was a couple of panics really, and a few of them are different, but we wrapped them all up. There's still issues with GoCar v2 indexes. It is possible to receive a malformed GoCar index and have that cause problems for you. But as part of this release, we've sort of increased the wording in the API about not consuming indexes that you don't trust. It's just not a good idea. The car v2 index stuff is not intended to be something that you pass around between untrusted parties. It was meant, it's sort of like it's something that you use for your own concerns, and then you pass around the car v1 and regenerate the index as you need it. So we've increased the language there. We do have a to-do to deal with the issues in the indexes, but they're a little bit more, there's a little bit more change that needs to go on to make that happen nicely. So we'll get to that. I have another thing to do with cars. I've got a pull request in each of GoCar and JSCar. This came, it's an experiment. They're draft PRs. I don't know if they'll get merged. I don't know, maybe they'll sit open for a while, collecting a bit of dust, but we'll see. The request was, it was initially, we want to be able to put more metadata into cars. So we want to extend the car header and just pack it full of stuff. And that's a bit of a no-no for the current format, because it's just going to break stuff. Like we could do that, but it would be a car v3 kind of thing. So instead I took the car v2 flexibility around where the car v1 offset, where car v1 is placed within the v2, and sort of pushed it back and put a little flag in to say that there's a message object that is embedded after the car v1 header. So this then allows you to encode an arbitrary DAG-CBOR encoded blob as a message in a car. And you can do things like, you can store metadata about the car v1. So let's say you're using a car v1 for a Filecoin deal. So car v1 needs to be sort of pristine. This thing gets stored, and it has a COM-P, which is the proof of the bytes. You could put that COM-P in this message, and you could put other things about it that don't necessarily go in the thing. So it's a good place for metadata. Whether or not this will be needed is a different question. I don't really want to push ahead with it unless there's a real need. It's sort of like, it's a slightly unnatural, but it does work. So anyway, feedback welcome, but again, I don't know if this will be flipped to a proper PR until there's a real need. Lastly, I just clicked merge on GoIPLD Prime 018.0. and I will put some extra notes in here. But the changes are all in by node. There's three major things that come in by node. One is custom type converters, so by node is really good with inferring how to translate from plain Go types to data model nodes. But it's often the case that you want to work with more than plain types, or you have your own specific ways to encode things. So there's some really good examples in Filecoin that this was actually one the work came out of. Things like there's other places where we use big.int and we can't with int for that, but but we can use, but they do get encoded as bytes. So with this change, when you wire up a type with by node, you say that the big.int, or otherwise known as what is it called, token amount. There's a sort of big int wrapper. There's actually two layers of big int wrappers in there, but it's all the same. So you'd say, whenever you encounter a token amount, use this encoder and decoder pair to get it to and from bytes. So as a Go type, you get the token amount, but as a node, when you get the IPLD data model form of it, you get a bytes. And so this allows you to extend the kinds of types that you can have in your Go structs and etc. for by node. Another thing it does is it wires up that uint64 support that I've talked about before, so that it is in by node. So now you can your Go types, you can use uint64 and get the full range. And lastly, there is just a utility registry in there for by node, allowing you to a central place to register and perform operations on your Go types with by node. So you initially set up a type with a schema. So this is my Go type, here's my schema. You register them, and then later on you perform operations based on that type. Either you give it that type and you say, I want the data model form of it, or I want it to be encoded with DAG-CBOR or whatever, and you say this is my type and this is what I want to do with it. And yeah, so it's just a utility thing. It's not necessary, but it does make life a little bit easier when you're dealing with multiple types through by node. So they're my main things. Who would like to go next? Adine, you're still writing, so do you want to?
I can go next, but I had a question about, or a question/comment about the CAR-V2 indices. Yeah. Which is, so even though like loading them all into memory, I guess, is a trusted operation. I suspect that you could use some of the like reader at for indices stuff to let you do things like sort of like the equivalent of running bitswap against a car file.
Yeah.
Which is to say, like, I could be like, do you have this block? Well, I can do the binary search inside of your index and say yes or no. And then if yes, then I can go fetch the block. And I could like incrementally verify the data that way, even when it's not the one special case where my linearized IPLD selector matches the exact way in which you've linearized your car file.
So Giroppo actually did that in the first round of this. He actually came up with a thing, and we managed to make it work nicely, where it was like a lazy load of indexes, and it would do some of that for the index types that we cared about. It's just that it required a big API change, and that API change was a bit too traumatic for
security
for downstream users.
Sure.
Yeah, it was, and it was also like to be clear, to be honest about this, it was Boost is the biggest consumer of the GoCars V2 API, and Boost was really like, it was already a big change to get Boost to adopt some of these security fixes, but having a lazy loading of the indexing was just a bit too much, and so we punted on that for now. And I don't know whether, because there are a lot of cases where you just want to say, I want to load this all in memory because it's fast. So I think this is the thing where we'll probably have to have different APIs, where if you want to read an untrusted one, then you can do it this way. But it still brings back to the thing of maybe you just shouldn't read an untrusted index, because why would you trust it? Because maybe it's just wrong. Just regenerate it yourself.
Well,
yeah.
unless you want to do what I'm saying, right? Which is like you have a car file and I want to download some subset of the blocks inside of the car file, right? Like basically I want to have like, you just host like the, all of the current snapshot of Wikipedia as a car file with a humongous index. And I want to be able to download that index. I want to be able to download the subset of Wikipedia that I want over HTTP. And I can do that because like I can grab the blocks from the car file that I need to.
Yeah.
As dictated by the index. And like if your index is lying to me, then I'll download some data I don't like, and then I'll be like, I don't like you anymore. No more using you.
Yep.
That'll be the end of it. Is that code that Dropo wrote anywhere at the moment, or is that sitting in like a closed branch in like a security repo?
With the intention was to pull it across.
Okay.
So if it's not there, let me just have a look. Maybe it's not. So there's an index. There's an issue number 314 that Dropo open, but
okay.
And he links to the go-kart-proof repo you should have access to, but we should
just copy that.
Pull that. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, and we actually did a lot of work on it. I was just looking at that. We did like we had tests and all sorts of stuff that worked nicely. So it was just a bit too much trauma.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, I guess I'll go on with a couple of things that were on my list. The first one is a proposal to move the management or the governance of the CID spec to the IPFS specs process, or the IPIP. And there's an issue for that I linked in multi-format/CID. The reason I am asking this in general is because even though nobody has made a multi-formats spec PR in quite a long time, Michael has put one out for a CID v2 thing. And even aside from any technical considerations around that proposal, question is like, how are we going to figure out how this goes? And while those folks interested in IPLD and who've been carrying a lot of the burden there generally are the ones who've been carrying a lot of the multi formats aside from multi-adder burden. IPLD has less specs process around it. So figured we would just lend IPFSs for now. And if an IPLD one emerges, then we'll hand it right back. Yeah, if you have thoughts, thumbs up, thumbs down, other things, that'd be a good place to drop them. Yeah.
I just have one question, which might be useful to address now. So is the idea that we use the IPIP to draft a new spec for CID v2 or for the existing CID, but then also have the spec in the usual multi-formats location? Or is it that the spec will only live in the IPFS specs repo?
I think we should leave it in the place that people are used to it being in. It's more just like, what's the process we're going to use for when we want people to write things up in a particular way that gives sufficient information? Which of the various ways in which you could write something up would we like you to do it in, so people have a consistent way? And then when we need to decide how we're going to do our version of rough consensus, how are we going to do this? And we need to figure this out in the IPFS context, and there's a larger crowd of people there who are all affected by basically a lot of the IPLD specs anyway. So might as well do it there. Yeah. Again, if there was more of this in the IPLD context, I'd say like, yeah, just the CID spec is used by a lot of people, but IPLD seems the best steward of that spec. Just seems like in the meanwhile, IPFS might be a good one.
Cool, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's cool because like I mean, there's still like, I still think the current CID spec should be updated to basically how we currently use CIDs and not how it was supposed to work. Like basically the whole like base encoding thing, that the base encoding is part of the CID, which is not really true anymore. Like no one uses it this way. So I think it should be changed. But I would also be happy to basically going through a process, because like I wouldn't feel comfortable basically just like doing a PR on the spec and then Rod says it's okay and then it's merged, and like because like it's such a central spec, it's like,
Yeah.
if it goes through the IPFS process, IPIP process, I think it's basically, yeah, I would feel better about making changes, because like, yeah, then we have agreement somehow. So yeah, cool.
Yeah. Rod, did you have something?
I have an item on my task board to do governance stuff in multi-formats, and it's a long-standing one, so this is probably a good step since I haven't got to it yet. Yeah, is it simply just does it come out as emergency that there's because of this proposal that we don't want to, like,
Yeah, it's sort of
go
like
too
I
fast on
don't. It's not even a go too fast. It's like if I pull up the proposal, my first comment when I read it was like, this is missing sufficient context for most people in the community to evaluate this. Can you add more context? And the response was, well, I don't know how the governance process for this works. I don't want to invest more time into writing up, the alternatives and whatever, if I don't know if it's going to go anywhere. And so I'm like, and I'm similarly like, I'm not going to invest any time in evaluating and responding on any of the technical considerations if we don't have like a mechanism for deciding what happens at the end of this. And so that's kind of where this comes from. Again, nobody has touched the multi-format specs in a long time, so no one's needed to think too hard about this. My personal bent or suspicion is that like the more widespread a spec is, the more widespread consensus you need before you can change that spec.
Yeah.
Aside from just like making a new thing, right? Like anyone can always specify whatever it is they're doing. No one can stop anyone from writing any code, right? But yeah, I suspect the more ingrained a particular spec is in the concept and what that name means, the more consensus you need to change it to whatever the next thing is. I can't just make up whatever I want and make it HTTP4, right? There's like a lot of stakeholders in what HTTP means, and getting from 1 to 1.1 to 2 to 3 is like a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, I agree. I have no problem with it at all. I just have it. It's still in my backlog to look at the PR and just have a look over the details, because I'm not familiar with the spec process, IPIP spec process. So I'll have to look at that. And yeah, but to me, in principle, it's fine. Yeah, because I do see difficulty in moving forward with the CIDV2 thing. It's just, and it's difficulty just in terms of process, given that it's not a knock it out of the park type of thing where everyone looks at it and says, yeah, that's awesome. I mean, a lot of people are, but a lot of people are saying, maybe not. So that kind of situation does make it tricky. Yeah.
Yeah, and even I guess to be clear, like you can look at the linked stuff. The IPIP, like the process is not explicit about, it's not explicit about some of the things that tend to end up being fuzzier anyway. Like what does rough consensus mean in a group that doesn't have like, right? It's not like a formal, like no, like formalized, here are the entities and their respective voting powers. It's just like, do we tend to agree on this thing or not?
Yeah.
But at least the rest of it, that's like, why are you doing, what is the change? Why are you doing it? What were the alternatives? What are the ramifications? That kind of stuff is there. Yeah, okay, so that was that one. Another, I guess, reporting on things happening elsewhere that I happen to have seen. There are some people in the IPFS community who've been poking at some WebAssembly stuff, and some people who've reached out who are like, hey, you should look at this thing polywrap and consider that for how you write your code and deal with your ABIs and whatever. So they will be having a chat with some folks, I think on Friday. That should get recorded. I see Mov had a comment about WASM ABIs for WASM IPLD stuff, but the short version of my brief foray into Rust and WebAssembly so far is that you got to define your like interfaces to the outside world. If you've written FFI code, it's the same deal. Like, what are my C exports? Except that in this world, everything is an integer. Everything integers as far as the eye can see, integers. And there have been various specs or attempts at like creating standardized ways to do things that aren't integers, like byte arrays or strings or floats or whatever. All these things that you may sound familiar from your IPLD data model spelunking. And none of those, as far as I can understand, have crystallized into a real thing yet. And so everyone is still kind of YOLOing it, including the stuff that I YOLO'd for what WASM IPLD exists today. So ideally, maybe more standards, less YOLO. And then, we have to define our own ABIs on top of that for the functions we care about, but like at least some of the basics, strings, errors, whatever, could be covered by that. Yes. And speaking of the WASM IPLD stuff, there's like a PR that just sort of diffs like the origin with now. If you have questions about if you've like been poking at the code and you want to wonder how any of that works, you can ask questions there. I'm also happy to give people a more synchronous walkthrough. And I guess calling out that I will be less present starting in like a month from now for a while. So yeah, if there are things that you're like, hey, what were you doing about this? And you want to ask, let's do that sooner rather than later. And that is all for me. Oh, also, I guess there's a bunch of videos and stuff and interesting talks that came out of the IPFS thing event around IPLD stuff. The videos and stuff are not up yet. Hopefully they will be relatively soon. And I recommend taking a look because I feel like we made a bunch of progress in terms of helping people understand some of the leverage points that we get out of using IPLD as an abstraction layer for these different hash link data structures, rather than everyone trying to make their own next best Unix FS and then trying to, I don't know, advocate for them to be what's called Unix FS v2 or something like that. Like, surely we have better ways, like just allowing you to signal, here is my better version of a file system structure, and then letting people use it.
Do you know what the holdup is on those videos? Because it's been a while.
Yeah, it could be a few things. The one thing that I am determined to get to the bottom of is like at the beginning of every one of these events, it's like, okay, can we get videos like the day of so that we can see what's been going on if they're just raw, so we can like at least get the info out. And it's like, oh yeah, we're totally gonna do it this time, and it never happens. And I'd like to understand if this is like an actually fixable thing, or if this is important because every so often you give a presentation and you make a mistake. You leak your like machine's credentials, or you show an email you weren't supposed to, or you say something that you weren't allowed to, or whatever. And people are concerned about that, and they want to get those all cleaned up before the videos go out. So I think I want to understand that for the next event. I think for now, the videos are still in review. Yeah, I'd like them to get out sooner rather than later, because these things have half-lives of excitement that start to die down unless you re-energize them quickly.
I have a question about the WASM stuff. So you mentioned you're going to be shifting focus in a month from now. Is there someone that's like leading the way on all the WASM stuff other than you? Because I think there's the IPVM stuff as well, where we've got a group now, but what's the relationship between that and the work you're doing, and like who else cares about this as like an actual project?
I'm not sure. So I think there's a bunch, like, I think IPVM has like a wide surface that it's trying to cover. Hopefully some of the details around that working group will show up soon, give a little idea of where people are actively trying to do work. I kind of wanted to have some functioning code that I could show people to work from, because again, you can sit there and like bike shed about these ABIs like all day, because everything is integers as far as the eye can see, and there's no good way to do anything. But you can just like choose something and then it works. So I think what's interesting here is that the WASM IPLD stuff, like it just pushes you to, it just pushes at like, what are the things that actually need resolution, which is, if you do it the way I have it hooked up into Kubo right now, it doesn't matter if the ABI is wrong, because you have to sort of, there's no auto loading, you sort of plug them in manually in the config file. And so you can recompile them just like you do other plugins as the ABI changes. But what you do need is to figure out things like, how do I do ADL signaling anywhere, right? And so that brings us to like that the thornier stuff around, yeah, IPLD, whether it's IPLD URI schemes or changing the IPFS URI scheme or whatever. You know, like those sorts of things become more prevalent, or things like, if I wanted to describe a file system more abstractly, right? How would I do it? Right, so that I can do things like export as a tar file, both UnixFS and BitTorrent directories or Git directories, right? Like, how do I do both of those? So I think what's interesting is that those sort of surfaces like the real questions, and then like, what does the ABI look like for the WebAssembly stuff turns into like the red herring of like, I think we're going to need to just keep iterating on it and realizing we keep getting it wrong until later, and then, you know, and see how that goes. There are folks who have, there's some like interesting trade-off stuff around the people who want to like auto load in, who want to like basically automatically load in codecs and ADLs and that sort of thing by CID of the WebAssembly, and then how you want to deal with different versioning around all of that and ABIs. And that sounds like another level of complexity, but I figured a step at a time. If we can do like hard-coded, we can do hard-coded stuff and we can evolve the ABI, then we can figure out a better ABI and standardize and all of that. That was sort of the approach I was taking. There's nobody who's like designated as the taker over of the WASM IPLD repo. I will happily transfer it to the IPLD org and let anybody who wants to play around with it, play around with it. That's kind of my my stance, I guess. And hopefully the Kubo people will have in Sego support so that we can use a Rust VM whenever we decide we're ready to hit the merge button.
Do you see sorry, this problem of the interface, you know, transferring anything other than bytes between WASM and the runtime? This has been a long-standing thing for WASM. Like we were looking. This was why we didn't go further 3 years ago with IPLD when we were looking at it. Like this, Volker was playing with this, and it was like, well, let's wait until this is sorted out, until this solidified on a standard. So now that you've got your head in there, are you seeing a path to any standard, or are we just going to have to pick away and just say that's how it is?
I guess my thought is, to some extent, like a little bit like who who cares? Like, as long as you don't have to. I know everyone wants to like skip to the nth step where they like have dynamically loaded CID WASM things with like and everything just sort of like auto loads and works. For now, I would just settle with like not having to write every ADL and codec in like Go and Rust and Python and JavaScript and .NET and wherever in order to get self-certifiable data. So I think like the approach I'm taking is people seem to be moving forward in the WebAssembly world, but I don't know enough about that. But I do know that we can still get some of the benefits, even if not all of the benefits, even if we just sort of start earlier. If that, I don't know if that does that sort of make sense? Right, there's like sort of there's like a few different ways in which WebAssembly helps you. One is like, I don't want to write my code 5 times. I want to write sort of the interface wrapper once. And then the other is, I want to have, dynamic auto code loading things flying all over the place. And I think they're both pretty cool, but I think we can do one at a time, and that's not terrible.
I think we do have we have a benefit in that our data model is relatively straightforward. So it could be that we are waiting on an ecosystem that is trying to solve all of the things, and we just want to split the subset solve because we solve the rest of those things on top of our data model, kind of thing. So we just want to be able to transfer basic data model stuff.
Yeah, I would. So I'm kind of following what's happening a bit in my free time in the WASM world, since we tried to do it 3 years ago and it didn't happen. And so I would say, it's not anything in sight soon. So I would say, I would also say the benefit is that we have the data model. So I would probably just say, you just encode it as probably even CBOR, because, well, that's where we have codecs in every language. And basically just use CBOR as a transport layer for like whatever you pass around between WASM instances. As you likely in the IPLD world, you would likely depend on the data model anyway. So yeah, something like this. Because like this is also what so I'm not sure if it's still the case, but basically back then the exchange format for Rust to JavaScript was just JSON basically. So they just basically encoded as JSON, made a string out of it, passed over the string, passed the JSON again. And this is what they do in their code generation. And basically we could do the same thing with CBOR until basically people agreed on like whatever you will do. And I think the benefit also would be that I think like if I think about the C types you have normally in a C API FFI interface, you can easily map them to the data model. So even if you have fancier things built on top, it should be like serializable into IPLD. And but
that was sort of what I took with so there were like 2 iterations of this. There was trying it with codecs and then trying it with ADLs. Codecs, I defined a new thing, which was like a simplified version of DAG CBOR, or matched a little bit like Michael's simple DAG thing, except that it sort of matched the data model with all of the things instead of trying to take a more opinionated version, which is like, all of sort of the thorny things, like, do I have sorting in my maps? And it's like, well, I just need it to like cleanly translate across the boundary, right? I don't need to do any of the other correct things. So that was what that codec is for. Everything there seems okay, I think, with people, except for, I think I was like, I don't know what floats are. Rod suggested just go with IEEE stuff and with all of the gross nans, and it's fine. Call it somebody else's problem. If you have a better suggestion, there's this PR in IPLD/IPLD. And that worked for codecs. Sorry, go ahead, Rob.
No, that's fine. No, I have further things to say on it, but this is probably not the forum.
Yeah, so that worked for codecs. What became more difficult or more interesting was like ADLs, because the objects get bigger, right? Like I can't return to you bytes. I have to return to you like operators, like handles to operate on a stream of bytes, because they're just, it's a gigabyte of stuff. I'm not going to serialize a gigabyte of stuff and send it to you over the WebAssembly boundary. So that was like, okay, we have to like make up our own. I was like making up my own interfaces for dealing with that, and like, how do I do errors and what? So there's like a whole bunch of those sorts of things that we could do better. But I also think some of them are not going to have like the magic perfect standard when it exists is probably not going to cover all of what we need anyway. Like we're going to have to make some of it up anyhow. So we can do this, then we can start to think about questions like how do we version 2 the thing? And if people want to start considering like auto loading of stuff, how do they want to deal with a V3 the thing? Do they want to write WASM conversion wrappers that go from V2 to V3? Do they want to really scope down the API so that the probability of things that can mess up is much lower? I don't know. There's like a few different ways to go at this. I did notice that the ADLs, even in Go, which I mimicked for WebAssembly, were missing, like, I couldn't download a map all at once or do any sort of parallelism. This is sort of like an outstanding thing, which is most of IPLD Prime does not allow parallel downloading in a lot of places. And generally you can sort of figure it out, but in the ADL functions really like hide that from you. If you can't get at it, you can't get it. And so there are probably learnings from there around like, oh yeah, we should add more. Like Rod recently added a few optional interfaces to the IPLD Prime stuff. There's probably a few more optional interfaces to be added around getting better map access and list access than we have right now. Because iterators are linear, and that can be sad for parallelism.
All right. Yeah, so getting back to the roundtable. So next one is Mo.
Yeah, I'm also interested in the WASM stuff. So I've been following along since the IPFS thing. Super exciting. I really want to talk more about folks. I think there's the IPVM meeting sometime this week where we might also talk about more of this stuff, which could be useful. But outside of following along with all of the new stuff, I've been working a bit more on the IPLD gateway / URL spec. And the latest thing there is we're reconsidering how to do parameters in the path segments. So just to like recap, one of the motivations with the IPLD gateway spec / URL spec was to have signaling just be like an obvious part of each segment of the path traversal. So we could say like, at this segment, use this ADL, or at this segment, use this schema, or whatever else. And so I had initially pulled some syntax out of the ether based on the query params and using square brackets inside a path segment to kind of like have some query params looking parameters. However, on GitHub, it was proposed by, I forget the name of who proposed it. By Software Plumber. I don't remember their human name, but they proposed to use this syntax called matrix parameters, which has been around for a while in other areas of dealing with URLs and URIs, particularly in the XML space. And so it's pretty much the same as query parameters in that you have key value pairs where you have a key name equals and then some value. But rather than using ampersands, they're separated by semicolons. And we can also have that in a path parameter. So right now I'm kind of reworking some of my thinking because this might be easier to parse. It disambiguates where the parameters go inside a path segment, because before it wasn't obvious where those square brackets would go relative to the name of the path segment we're trying to traverse. So like, does it go before the name or after the name? In my initial exploration report, I'd written about how it might be a problem. And this matrix URI thing, it's nice in that it's an existing standard we could point to, and it's obvious where those parameters go and how they're encoded and stuff. So I'm actually working on adding that to the Ipip IPIP that I'm working on for it. And I'm going to be talking about how the escaping and stuff works with URL encoding and all of that. So not a huge difference, but I might talk to a dean later about trying to run that demo he did and seeing if I could do a PR towards it to update the parsing. One thing I'd like to do soonish is to add, I think probably a Go library for actually parsing these URLs so that folks can see how it works and maybe use it. And probably also a JavaScript library, maybe. Yeah, so that's kind of progressing. I've also been reaching out to some other gateway authors outside of Kubo, particularly the new IRO thing in Rust that's been working on. So I'm going to try to poke and pester them and see if they're interested in adopting the IPLD in their core gateway stuff. Yeah, so that's the main thing, but honestly, a lot of my time has been spent just following up on stuff from the IPLD thing or IPFS thing. So I've been kind of busy with that. Yeah, so if folks have comments about IPLD URLs or gateway ideas, feel free to post in this Specs PR that I linked to in the HackMD. That's actively a work in progress. Yeah, I guess that's it for me.
Thanks. Next one is Musin.
Yeah, thank you. I've made a few final updates to amend. There were a couple of questions that Mo raised that we should probably discuss whenever we can, maybe this call, about packaging and where to really fit that code. And other than that, I also put up a draft PR for potential way to do map and list access that is less complicated than assemblers and builders, and that also uses amend underneath, so you kind of get modification transparently. And Mauve mentioned in that PR about iterators and maybe concurrent access, and Adin, you brought that up in the past as well. So I think it is possible with the model I'm trying to get. So maybe we can chat about that as well. So those are all my updates.
Should we talk about it now?
Yeah.
Regarding the amend thing, I think the last little bit we were talking about is the actual file names and like where should this amend code live.
Yes.
I think you made a good point about how amend is like its own thing, and it might be good to take it out of traversal and again either have it like top level or be inside node or something. I was wondering if Rod or Adin or someone else had thoughts on where to put it. I just know for sure it feels weird to have all the amend related things inside traversal with just like amend prefix to each file name. Just like smells a lot like a module.
Yeah.
I understand why it's there, because traversal has a lot of this. I think amend is born out of the operations that traversal does, but I think Mohsin, you've raised some good points. Just reading your thread, the latest thread that you had on your map and list idea, that thinking of amend as an ADL, that is an interesting idea, because, and if you do that, then it certainly comes out as something very different to something that belongs in traversal. So yeah, it possibly is something. I don't know about if it should go under node, but possibly. It's just that the kinds of stuff we have, the subdirectories under node are all they're like implementations of nodes. This is sort of, but it's a bit lower level than that. So maybe, but yeah.
Yeah,
Let's find a home for it. Yeah.
So I just want to say I tried to have it in its own package under traversal. That didn't work because of circular dependencies, because now that it's integrated into focus, it needs access to progress and all the things that are in traversal. And so it can't be a package inside traversal, because traversal needs it and it needs traversal. So that was a little messy. So I ended up with that ugly prefixed amend. It does look like it should be its own module, but yeah, we can chat about where to put it. What's a clean way to do it?
So which of the bits, sorry, it needs progress in there?
Yeah, so when I integrated into progress, or we're integrated into focus, progress is part of traversal, allows you to kind of track the path and do like budgets for the traversal. And that's kind of what so that's required by both traversal and by amend, if amend is to follow the pattern that focus does. But I mean, we could do it a different way, not use progress and budgets, or have its own implementation of progress and budgets or whatever, something like that.
Yeah, it could just maybe just an interface that matches progress.
Right. Yeah. I don't want to depart too far from where things were before, like discussing with y'all. So I'm totally open to whatever options I think might work.
I had one more hornet's nest I wanted to kick while we're here. So again, I apologize for the lack of videos. I've been bugging my hardest. But yeah, so in addition to sort of kicking some WASM hornets and some data model hornets before the event, I also was pitching a proposal I had last year around how to deal with some of the security ramifications of that come with having block limits that, or not having block limits. The people seem to be reasonably on board with like the mechanism for being able to deal with like your standard Merkle-Damgard based functions like SHA-2 and SHA-3. SHA-1 maybe not, because it's already a sketchy hash function as is, for allowing you to incrementally verify that data. I linked the presentation in my notes. One of the sort of interesting things that falls out of this is that I think for a while we've been hiding behind like the security issues as the reason why we have these block limits that prevent interoperability with other formats like, Git or BitTorrent or whatever that chose a higher block number than we did. But if you remove the security concerns, you now have to start talking about like, well, was there anything more important? Was there anything else that was important here? Like when I build my IPLD libraries or tooling, are there things where I'm concerned where I want some number in there, or maybe I don't care, right? Like as an example, if I when writing like the WASM IPLD stuff, if I just serialize all the data in a block into like the WebAssembly codec and then ship it across the boundary, that seems fine if it's only like a couple megs, but probably not fine if it's like 100 megs, right? Or similarly, if I have a block and the block is 100 megs and I can refer to it in some way, but there are people who want to ship car files around and the car files must be less than or equal to 100 megs. and their tooling will start to break. So there's some questions around like, sort of now that we can remove some of the security concerns, what we want to do about block limits, because at least my opinion is they kind of block us from doing some really cool interoperability work with existing hash linked formats. But there may be other considerations about how we build our stack that make us care about these sorts of limits, but not which we haven't defined in other places either. Like what's the limit size of a CID or a multi-hash, or right? There's like a lot of these like limits that people sort of are casually assuming are there, but might not need to be.
Sorry, how does this relate to amend again?
No, sorry, this was just one more hornet I wanted to kick before we were.
Oh, okay.
I waited for a lull. Maybe I didn't wait long enough for somebody else to chime in about amend.
Okay, sorry, that makes a lot more sense. I was having trouble wrapping it in my head.
Although they do sort of turn into each other a little bit, because if I start amending into a block and the block exceeds the size, right now I could just yell at you. But maybe I wouldn't just like, maybe the way in which I yell at you changes, right? If we don't have like strict like 2 MIB or go home kinds of limits. Yeah, so you can take a look at that for if you're interested in the how to deal with the security ramifications and the data transfer layer, but then we still have to figure out what's reasonable to do at the tooling layer.
Yeah, and it looks like what you're proposing has imposes some heavy dependencies right up the layers, doesn't it? Like the way we encode things has to be in line for this to.
I mean, it's per block. It's just a way of transferring the blocks around, right? So it's just like saying, if your block is over a certain size, you have to use a special block transfer protocol. And maybe you have to store them a little differently if you want the special block transfer protocol to work nicely. You're just sort of dealing with it at the transport layer, but then the question is, I don't know, if I have a 100 megabyte object and then I wanted to interpret it as DAG JSON, would that be like fair game or not fair game? And the thing is, this isn't like news either, because if I allow for like, we'll call them recursive ADLs, I could do something like interpret this file as UnixFS and then interpret this file as DAG JSON, because I can have an ADL called interpret me as DAG JSON. And like, should that work or fail? And so we sort of end up in the same, I don't think this is so special. Maybe it is, because the codec layer is maybe more special than the ADL layer. But it feels like we end up in the same sort of place regardless, where maybe we're leaning on things like gas limits to figure out these kind of like, you're using too many resources, this is out of control kind of stuff.
Yeah, the resource budgeting with the smaller block limits is straightforward, but as we've expanded with ADLs, primarily with ADLs, but still this layering that we can do, these resource problems are coming in the way, and we're actually dealing with this now with some of the data transfer stuff with bind node, where we're layering decodes of the nodes, and that means we've got multiple copies of the nodes hanging around, but they're stacked, and that's really awkward. And that's only for small messages too. It's just that we've got a lot of them, but yeah, this resource problem does seem to be something that we have to pay a lot more attention to, and maybe the complexity of our layering makes that really hard.
I mean, to some extent, this is where like maybe some of the WebAssembly stuff ends up helping, instead of just being like, it's this abstraction layer we're paying a cost for, so I don't have to rewrite my code in, Fortran. But because they, it's sort of easier. There are all these people who are trying to do instrumentation and other things around the WebAssembly binaries to tell you like how many resources you're using, at least at the compute layer. And you can do your other sort of management around the memory layer.
All right, we are almost running out of time. I saw that Steve joined. Do you have anything to say? We have still 2 minutes.
I wish. No, my other reading ran way long, but I was just here for the party, so nothing to add. Thanks for
Okay.
I'll just add for Mohsin, the PR on maps and lists and the container thing, really interesting. I'd be happy for you to open that up against the IPLD Prime repo. You can do it as a draft, just for discussion, get more eyes on it. There's not that many of us that are even looking at the repo, so don't feel like it's gonna be noisy. So feel free to open it there. You can frame it as this is just an idea. That's fine. But I find the idea really interesting. So it might be good to take that further.
Well, thank you.
Can we move the pull request from the existing repo to Go IPLD Prime? Is that possible?
You can retarget, I think. You can retarget what
Oh,
you're
I can. Yeah, I
again.
think so. I'll try that.
Cool, if that works.
All right.
Yeah, but
Across
any of these things in the future, Mohsin, feel free to open them as drafts, as just discussion starters in IPLD Prime. It's not.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
All right. Then thanks everybody for attending. And we see us again in 2 weeks. So goodbye, everyone.